Okay, here's where we have a disclaimer. The territory we're venturing into next can be sensitive to some folks. I realize there are a lot of different ways that people relate to their religious traditions and worldviews. My intention is not to offend anyone or make someone feel like their way to approach the sacred or eternity or any of that is wrong. But in order to put into context so much of the artwork from this point in our timeline until at least through the 18th century, we have to grapple with the religious underpinnings that inform it. In some respects, this is no different than talking about ancient Egyptian rituals or Roman bacchanalias, which we've done. Except that you'd be hard-pressed to find a student who believes with all their heart that the Egyptian god Atum created the universe by ejaculating into the ether. There might be a few bacchanalians among us, but they don't call it that anymore anyway. The thing is, the three foundational Western religious traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are still very much a part of our cultural point of view today. Each one is every bit as meaningful to adherents now as divining chicken guts was to the ancient Roman. And that immediacy carries a deep psychological and emotional weight, and therefore sensitivity. We all grew up learning that Hitler was evil incarnate, which is hard to argue. But we learned that Alexander the Great was an amazing individual who changed the world. Of course, he committed genocide to an unspeakable degree. And if you would have asked people in the immediate aftermath of Alexander's conquests, particularly the ones he just conquered, how they felt, they'd likely describe him in similar terms to how we see Hitler. Nazi Germany happened less than a century ago, and each of us might still have relatives who were personally affected by the fascist policies of the Third Reich. The horrors of Alexander are so distant that they're entirely outside our personal experience. That distance is a moral distance. The real, intense, physical, and emotional pain caused directly by Alexander is neither here nor there for us. So it's the same with one's religious outlook. If you have a certain distance from it, the rawness and profundity is no big deal. I mean, we're just analyzing basic tenets and historical facts from a lofty academic point of view, in the spirit of the free marketplace of ideas. But if the dogmas and traditions of the particular religion we're talking about are the most central focus of your being, some yahoo coming along and pointing out inconsistencies and hypocrisies can be infuriating. I don't want to infuriate anyone. I do want to present this information in the most accurate and compassionate way that I can. So, we have late antiquity and the early Christian era. This was a transitional period that became the foundation of the Middle Ages. The key issue of the time, religion. In the classical era, religion was important, but it was really just one of many factors. It becomes the biggest influence on art and culture in the West from this point forward. So the context is important to understand. Western religious tradition is Judeo-Christian Islamic. That is, these three faiths provide the underpinnings. These are the Abrahamic faiths, each in succession in a sort of lineage from the previous one. They all have common origins, the same idea of a single God, and the same important early figures. Here's some significant dates for our discussion. Around 1200 BCE is the emergence of Judaism. Right around 4 BCE is the birth of Jesus. 313 is the Edict of Milan. You'll see why this is important in a bit. 390 is when Christianity becomes the official religion of Rome, and 610 sees the emergence of Islam. Judaism was established as a religious tradition by 1200 BCE. They were a tribe of people, a single religious identity transferred through generations. They started a kingdom of their own that happened to lie on an important trade route, so they were often attacked by other peoples. But things were going all right. But then they were struck by famine and had to move south to Egypt. When they arrived, it didn't go as well as they probably hoped. In fact, their situation was likely similar to that of the immigrant laborers crossing our border, basically slavery. After some commotion and serious challenges to the status quo, they escaped with Moses. He had a suspiciously similar life story to a lot of the other ancient leaders we've discussed, which is a little coincidental, but that's beside the point. They wandered through the desert for 40 years, searching for a home. They made a covenant with their God, Yahweh. It involved 10 commandments, which will certainly come up later in our story. Eventually, they found the promised land, probably to the dismay of the folks who were already there. And then it was all well and good again, until they were taken over by the Romans, pretty much like everyone else in the region. Christianity started as a sect of Judaism, but eventually embarked on a solo career and became its own thing. The connection was Christians saw Jesus as the Messiah promised in Jewish tradition, who would kick out the Romans and restore the homeland to Jewish rule. It didn't happen that way exactly. The central figure of Christianity is a Jewish man called Jesus. Most of his life is a mystery. In his early 30s, he started teaching in public, one of those bearded professor types. According to tradition, he said anyone can be saved and find everlasting life in the kingdom of God. There was a lot of peace and love, anti-establishment, rabble-rousing, and a clear distrust of money and power. He collected followers along the way. He soon becomes a local folk hero / cult leader. Jewish authorities worry he's creating social unrest and undermining their authority. They convince one of his disciples to turn him over. He's sent to the Roman governor and tried for treason. Well, he did say he was the king of the Jews. He was sentenced to die like any petty criminal or nut job of that era, crucifixion. That's the more or less agreed upon part. Christian theology is formed by the basic story of his life, taken from Gospels, which were sacred writings that tell the story of his life. Many existed, but 4 of them made the cut and became the official book. They form separate accounts that describe different events of Jesus' life. Taken together, generally, this is what follows the crucifixion. He's resurrected after a few days. He wanders some more, then he ascends into heaven. But he's supposed to come back for apocalypse, when the dead would be raised and everybody would be judged. Early Christianity was completely different from the Christianity that eventually becomes respectable in the Roman world. Over time, it would become the largest religious influence on Western culture and perhaps the entire world. Formative Christianity was initially called the Way, sharing that name with the Eastern tradition of Taoism. There was much disagreement about the theological particulars, especially the nature of Jesus. 3 parts, 1 God. Was he part of God? Was he separate from God? How does that whole thing work? The beliefs were based largely on many separate writings scattered all around. And there was a lot of variation in dogma from place to place. But most of all, it was a scrappy little religion of the underdogs. Its message was inherently attractive to the downtrodden, with a moral code geared towards the subjugated. Its focus on the afterlife was comforting to people whose life, here and now, was particularly hard. By this time, Rome was sort of fading. Things weren't going super well, and it needed scapegoats. Christianity was famously persecuted. They were this other, a foreign influence that threatened to infiltrate respectable society and change the Roman way of life and the most cherished traditions of Rome. Consequently, believers mostly practiced secretly in private houses and sometimes even in underground cemeteries. The catacombs. The ostracized Christians and Jews buried their dead in what became vast underground complexes, intricate systems of galleries and passages, one on top of the other. Bodies were placed in chambers along the sides of the passageways. Early Christians didn't want to be cremated because they were supposed to be resurrected soon, like any day now. You'd hate to miss out on that just because you had no body left. These burial chambers were often decorated with frescoes. This is the Good Shepherd fresco. It was located within Rome itself, or under it rather. And this is a typical early depiction of Christ. In the center, the youthful shepherd boy, not a bearded king with a halo. There were certainly no crucifixion images until much later. You can also see the Jonah and the whale story to the right. It looks more like a sea monster here. The whale thing might have been an error in translation. Paintings in the catacombs portrayed somewhat crude versions of classical imagery. You'll notice a similarity to this earlier Greek sculpture, the calf bearer. Youthful Greek Kuros, association with the god Apollo, whose imagery early Christians appropriated into the imagery of Jesus. The pagan symbol of the shepherd made sense, so it was assimilated into early Christian imagery. The shepherd to flock analogy was a powerful metaphor. In the catacombs, the work is somewhat shoddy. You have to understand, this is underground in both senses of the word. Forbidden and outside mainstream culture, but also literally underground amongst a bunch of dead bodies. Sort of poor working conditions. And the stench of decomposing corpses must have been remarkable. So I doubt the artists working there lingered any longer than they had to. And let's just say the catacombs didn't attract the top artist of Rome. Another classical Christian link is Sol Invictus, the Roman god of the unconquered sun, whose image was often appropriated in early Christian images of Jesus as well. All sorts of references to Jesus as light of the world in Christianity. Sunday as the day of rest was declared originally in the honor of Sol Invictus, one of many influences on the new faith. And when Christmas was created in the West, it occurred on the same day as the traditional celebration for Sol Invictus. Near the winter solstice sort of makes sense, the rebirth of the sun. Other ways the imagery of this Roman god was influential on early Christian art was the nimbus halo, the sun rays from the head. As Christianity becomes more legitimate within the power structure of the empire, the image of Sol Invictus is directly appropriated for images of Christ. It's Christ as authority figure rather than Christ as an outcast. Christians had a secret code to identify one another. The word fish in Greek is an acronym, kind of like a meme. I'm not going to pronounce it ichthys, but the letters spell out in Greek, Jesus Christ, God, Son, Savior, iota, chi, theta, epsilon, sigma. It also makes sense because the image of fish is a recurring theme in the stories surrounding the life of Jesus, like the loaves and fishes miracle. If a person met someone on the road that they thought might be a fellow Christian, they drew a curving line in the sand. If the other person drew the complementary line, finishing the design, they knew that both were followers, kind of like a secret handshake. Rome usually had no problem with various religions in its empire. It was a formality, really. You pay lip service to the emperor, and we let you go about your business. But these Christians were different. They refused. Early Christian martyrs were steadfast. Usually the Romans didn't want to kill them, but the Christians sort of forced them to do it by their refusal. And this made them more of a nuisance than the average provincial religious cult from the desert. Official persecution was meant to stamp out Christianity, but it ended up strengthening it. Christians were famous for not compromising their faith, which was basically public suicide. Think of the self-immolators in Tibet during the Vietnam War. Suicide in public gets attention. The way they sacrificed themselves for their unusual beliefs got a lot of attention, and the faith spread. Public sympathy, along with an attractive belief system in the social and economic climate of the struggling empire, led to increasing popularity. They were still relatively small in numbers, but growing. In the early 300s, things happened in quick succession to affect Christianity. This is the story of the Emperor Constantine and the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. It's a story originally told by an early Christian bishop named Eusebius. It's not really verified truth, but it doesn't matter. The year was 312. Roman power had been divided between 4 people, and some people just didn't want to share. There was Constantine versus Maxentius, locked in a vicious fight to consolidate power in the West. On the eve of the decisive battle, Constantine has a vision, telling him he'll be victorious if he puts a Christian mark on his shields. Possibly this symbol, the first 2 letters of Christ, Chi Rho. He does it and wins the battle. Then he takes charge of the whole western half of the empire. Was the story true? Maybe. Though it also makes a lot of political sense. The context affecting the situation is this. Rome had been ruled by separate emperors for a while. The western part of the empire in particular was struggling. Cults like Christianity were much more accepted in the East, where Rome was at its strongest. Winning this battle was just the first step in his eyes. He wanted the East too. Some of Constantine's soldiers were Christian. His mother was rumored to be secretly Christian too, so he was already more tolerant than the average emperor to Christianity. So this was a pretty good deal all around. In 313, he issues the Edict of Milan, with a reluctant co-emperor in the east named Licinius. This ended official persecution of people belonging to non-official religions within the empire. And you gotta like the wording here. It's kind of like, trying to cover all your bases. Whence any divinity whatsoever in the seat of the heavens may be kindly disposed to us. However, Christianity is explicitly named in this document. In 324, Constantine had his co-emperor executed and becomes the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. He creates an eastern capital of Rome in Byzantium. Christianity quickly becomes the main religion of the empire. But diverging ideas of what Christianity was made it hard to pin down. Separate regions had their own views. Sometimes these views were very different from one another. The factions became hard for the Roman Empire to control. There was a lot of fighting amongst the different sects. In 325, Constantine convenes the Council of Nicaea. It was a meeting of local Christian leaders from across the empire, around 300 of them. They codified Christian doctrine. They officially decided on the most contentious issue, which had to do with the relationship of Jesus to God. Was this all a single entity or separate parts? They decided it was indeed a single entity. Well, kind of, sort of. And any beliefs contrary were heretofore heretical and extremely definitely not tolerated. This marks the end of Christianity's formative years. It's now a real player on the scene. The religion changes to adapt to its newfound place at the top. It develops a hierarchical power structure parallel to the Roman bureaucracy. Then Constantine builds churches. He stayed outside of central Rome. The old guard was still mostly held traditional religious beliefs at this point, and he didn't want to offend their powerful sensibilities. Here's a medieval drawing of Old St. Peter's Cathedral, the original church. Construction started around 330 on the outskirts of Rome. No longer did Christians have to worship in private. Churches needed to accommodate more people. The design for the earliest churches was an adaptation of typical Roman basilicas or meeting halls. These were very different and similar to Greco-Roman temples. How? That might make a good question on a test. They have a wide central nave with lots of space inside, and an arch separated the nave from the area around the altar. Here's a cross-section image from a drawing made in the Middle Ages. You can get a sense of the space inside. As Christianity becomes more and more acceptable, wealthy people, Notable public figures even begin to convert. This is the sarcophagus of Junius Bassus, found beneath Old St. Peter's. It would have been very expensive to make. Junius Bassus was an important senator and prefect who converted to Christianity just before he died. In this, we see indications of a changing style. Odd proportions, large head size, a bit stylized all around. This is high relief sculpture. Parts of it are practically in the round. It's organized into a series of elaborate arches with biblical scenes playing out beneath each one. Here's the sacrifice of Isaac. To prove his allegiance, Abraham is commanded to kill his son. We see Abraham holding Isaac by the hair, and he's just about to do it. Then the intercession of the angel from out of the blue. Whew, that was close. The nature of this Old Testament narrative is important. It's an early version of typology. Typology is the foreshadowing of New Testament events in the Old Testament. Abraham's willingness to kill his own son, Isaac, is like a god sacrificing his son. Prefiguration becomes a principal artistic device later on. There's a thematic balance in this sarcophagus sculpture. Suffering and redemption on either end, a triumphant Christ in the middle, and meticulous attention to detail. This is high quality work. In the top central scene, Christ's enthronement between Peter and Paul, his feet resting on Kylum, the Roman god of the sky. Why is that important? Christ enthroned meant Christ was royalty. Political power is legitimized for Christianity, atop the pagan god of the sky, and the heavens are an apt symbol. And a turning point in the way this religion was becoming part of the status quo in ancient Rome. This is Emperor Theodosius I. As Christianity got more popular, Rome makes it official. Emperor Theodosius issued a series of edicts. In 390, Christianity becomes the official religion of Rome. In 391, all pagan religions are banned completely. He even abolished the Olympics in 394 as a vestige of the infidel past. He sets the precedent for intolerance. This cuts society off from its previous traditions. Practically everything was considered pagan, notably math, science, art, all the good stuff from the classical era. It's tempting, if a bit of a generalization, to say all the progress made during the classical era was just thrown out the window. The Eastern Roman Empire doesn't make quite the same break with tradition as the West. Consider what the rejection of classical culture meant. Loss of advances made during the Pax Romana, and a complete political breakdown. This transforms Western Europe. It leaves a crumbling infrastructure. Regarding education, the literacy rate tumbles. Since nearly every book was pagan, why should everyday people learn to read? It also represents an extreme change of fortune for the little religion that could. It started from absolutely modest beginnings, with an emphasis on self-denial, poverty, love, and egalitarianism. Outcasts, prostitutes, the poor were seen as good, the wealthy and powerful not so good. What outcast wouldn't buy into that idea? As it says in the famous verse from Matthew 19, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. But now Christianity had to embrace the politics and social systems of the empire. Like in many gangster movies, it becomes the head honcho. Then it gets a little paranoid and perhaps forgets where it came from. If there's one constant that's played out over and over throughout history, it's that power corrupts. In 395, Theodosius dies. And once again, the empire splits, for good this time. The West becomes Roman Catholic and forms the Western European tradition using the Latin alphabet. Unfortunately, it's destined for a whole world of problems. In the East, they form the Eastern Orthodox Church. This is the basis for the Eastern European tradition. Countries like Russia, Ukraine, and Greece, they use the Greek alphabet. The Eastern Roman Empire stays very strong for a long time. We'll talk about Eastern developments in the next chapter. For now, we stay in the West, in the very late stages of the Western Roman Empire. Mosaics become popular in both West and East. They're a little different than traditional Roman mosaics. They're on the wall rather than on the floor, and they increasingly favored narrative over aesthetic. Their focus was on content as opposed to the classical concern with form. Here is Christ as Good Shepherd mosaic from the early 400s. And a bit later on comes the Miracle of the Loaves and Fishes mosaic from the year 504. You can see the depiction of Jesus has changed. Compare the two. In both, Jesus wears a purple and gold robe to signify royalty. There's also a halo in both, straight from Sol Invictus, the universal symbol of classical divinity. But the Good Shepherd is still rooted in classical style. There's some spatial accuracy in the landscape, a subtle illusion of mass, or chiaroscuro, which we discussed in week 1. There's slight movement in the turn of the shoulders, and the body moves together, somewhat like a classical Greek sculpture. The composition is natural and almost informal. There's a believable distribution of shapes. Look at the way the sheep are distributed around the composition, around the landscape. Compare that to the loaves and fishes on the right. Christ has a nimbus halo to signify the three parts of the divine, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And the body is frontal and positioned in a symmetrical pose. There's a contrived formal organization in the composition. Notice the symmetry that's kind of unnatural. It's flat. It's rigid. No earthly details are necessary here. It's categorically removed from the realm of the everyday world. Instead is an emphasis on the miraculous. It's purposely abstracted so the narrative can be told with the least number of distractions. There's hardly any landscape at all. The gold sky represents the heavens because gold equals wealth and power. The folds in the clothing aren't really convincing at all, but it doesn't matter. The floating feet make them out to be supernatural beings. See the differences between these two mosaics and these changing styles that happened very close together. This would also make a good test question. As we said, in the West, the empire was crumbling. Toward the end of the 5th century, they were overrun by Germanic tribes. After the fall of Rome, the Western Roman Empire becomes a collection of medieval feudal kingdoms. But as centralized political power waned, centralized religious power stayed in place. It established two separate parallel power structures. Politics was decentralized and broken into individual small entities. Religion, on the other hand, that remained centralized in the Roman Catholic Church. Without an educated population, Western Europe loses its ability to innovate through engineering, or even to maintain existing structures. Roads, buildings, public works all fell out of repair. All around them were ruins that spoke of the greatness of Rome, but nobody knew how to preserve or emulate it. As the centralized government of Rome faded, so did its relics, aqueducts, huge buildings like the Colosseum, highways, public baths. It's so interesting something like that can happen. Golden ages can be lost. Civilization regressed. Just like with the Assyrians, I'm sure nobody thought it could happen, but it did. Slowly, like the frog boiling in water. Over the span of generations, in some places it was so slow that people certainly didn't even realize they were regressing. But they did. It's kind of spooky.